Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. Some revised predictions for the domestic opening weekend box office revenue for Sony and Columbia Pictures' upcoming woke female disaster of a movie, Madam Web, have been released. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please subscribe to this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! Back in January, I had released a video explaining just how unlikely it is that Madam Web is going to perform well at the box office, thanks to several major issues resulting from multiple poor creative decisions made by Sony and Columbia Pictures. And those poorly conceived creative decisions include the lack of familiarity with the 4 D-list female Marvel superhero characters that the movie features as its protagonists, the all too many creative changes made to the characters' backstories, the complete reimagining of the titular character Madam Web into a young, healthy paramedic instead of being a blind, elderly old woman as originally presented in Marvel Comics, and the fact that the 2 writers that they selected to write this movie are the same ones who wrote that 2022 box office flop Morbius, as well as having a history of writing many other box office flops. I'll leave it up to viewers to watch the earlier video for all of those details. Back in January, Box Office Pro had predicted that the domestic opening weekend box office for Madam Web would likely range between $25 million to $35 million. But they revised that prediction a few days ago, and guess what? It did not go up. It went down. In fact, it dropped so far down that most of the revised predicted domestic opening weekend box office range of $15 million to $24 million now sits below the $22.1 million domestic opening weekend box office that the movie Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance earned back in 2012. And that's Sony's and Columbia Pictures' Marvel movie that currently has the record for lowest domestic opening weekend box office revenue. So given that range, there's a 55.6% probability that Madam Web won't even earn $20 million for its domestic opening weekend box office. And there's an even higher probability of 79% that Madam Web will become Sony and Columbia Pictures' record holder for lowest domestic opening weekend box office for their entire suite of Marvel movies. And there's only about a 21% probability of that not happening. So that's not a good sign for this movie, is it? To project what the final domestic box office earnings for Madam Web might be, I'll use a range of average weekly drops that are 1 standard deviation above and below the average for the entire suite of Sony and Columbia Pictures' 15 Marvel movies, which is 33.92%. And with a standard deviation of 10.38%, that gives me a range of possible average weekly drops ranging from 23.53% to 44.3%. which is a fairly wide range. So when I use the $19.5 million midpoint of Box Office Pro's predicted range as the approximate domestic opening weekend box office, along with that wide range of possible average weekly drops, I can project that the movie's final domestic box office may range somewhere between $44 million at the low end, $57.5 million at the mid-range, and $82.2 million at the upper end, which is far lower than the projection that I made in January. To provide some additional context, when we compare this projected range with the performance of other Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies, the mid-range projected final domestic box office value of $57.5 million is only slightly above the $51.8 million that Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance earned domestically back in 2012. And it's also nearly $20 million below the $73.9 million that Morbius earned domestically in 2022. So there's a high probability that Madam Web might either become the second lowest grossing Marvel movie domestically for Sony and Columbia Pictures, or the absolute lowest. As I said earlier in the video, this isn't a particularly good sign for this movie, is it? Now, to project what the final global gross box office for Madam Web might be, I will use the average domestic share for the 15 Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies, which is 40.97%, and 1 standard deviation above and below, which yields a range from 31.62% to 50.32%. And when I do that, I get a range of possible final global gross box office earnings ranging from a low of $87.5 million at the low end, $140.3 million at the mid-range, and $260 million at the upper end. And this is a much lower projected range than what I had projected back in January. To provide some additional context, when we compare this projected final global gross box office range with the performance of the other Sony and Columbia Pictures Marvel movies, the $140.3 million mid-range value is less than the $149.2 million that Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance earned globally back in 2012, as well as the $162.8 million that Morbius earned globally back in 2022. So there is a more than 50% probability that Madame Web might become the lowest grossing Marvel movie of all time for Sony and Columbia Pictures, or quite possibly the second lowest. As to whether Madame Web might break even, when I released my previous video about this movie in January, I had explained that different media sites were reporting a production budget for the movie of either $80 million or $100 million. So I had used a midpoint of $90 million in January, but the Numbers website has since listed that the movie's production budget is $80 million. Thus, I will revise my estimated break-even point calculations for the movie by using the lower $80 million production budget value. And when I multiply that reported $80 million production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget, that gives me an estimated break-even point ranging from between $200 million to $240 million. And based on the range of projected final global gross box office revenue for Madame Web, since the mid-range $140.3 million value has the highest probability of occurring, that's well below the estimated break-even point range. Thus, the probability that the movie Madame Web is going to flop at the box office is currently far higher than the probability that it's going to break even. I wasn't at all surprised when I saw that Box Office Pro's predicted domestic opening weekend box office values for Madame Web fell as much as they did, because I don't believe that most people have all that much interest in seeing this movie, as I had briefly explained earlier in the video. Madame Web is simply just one more failed attempt to push the woke feminist identity politics narrative by having an all-female ensemble cast of D-list superhero characters that are nothing like the characters that Marvel Comics had originally envisioned. Consequently, Madame Web is going to become just one more example of the saying, "Go woke, go broke." Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.